She was a queen, crowned by church and court, draped in velvet, hailed by choirs, kissed by power. And yet, she died hungry, not in a battlefield, not in exile, but in her own castle, in her bed, alone, without prayer, without witnesses. Not even a candle was lit when her breath stopped. Her name? Margaret of Denmark, Queen of Scotland, wife of James III, mother of the heir, daughter of a king. She was everything they prayed for, until she was nothing they cared to keep. They said she fell ill. Some whispered it was a sudden fever. Others claimed melancholy, as if grief itself had eaten her bones. But servants spoke of something else. The kitchens were locked. The queen's plate went cold, untouched, for days. She stopped asking. She stopped hoping. Imagine this: a castle, stone walls thicker than a man's height, tapestries so old they forget their colors, and in one room, a bed too large for a body growing smaller each night, a mirror that reflected only ribs and silence. She did not scream, she did not beg, because by then, Margaret knew something cruel. No one was listening. She had once laughed with dimples soft and bright, like rain melting on a window. She had danced, not with flair, but grace. And when she spoke, it was with care. Too much care, perhaps, because Scotland did not want a queen with gentleness. They wanted power. And Margaret only wanted to be heard, before the silence became her crown. Let us go back. Before the stillness, before the hunger, before the walls began to close in, let us return to the beginning, when a young girl from Denmark was sent across the sea, promised to a kingdom cold in both climate and heart, a girl meant to bring peace, and yet brought only the memory of her own funeral. What broke her? What silenced a queen so slowly that no one heard her vanish? Why did no one knock on her chamber door for days? This is not just a death. It is an unraveling of a marriage, of a monarchy, of a woman, and history barely blinked. This is not just a death. It is an unraveling of a marriage, of a monarchy, of a woman, and history barely blinked. But silence always starts somewhere, not with screams, but with whispers, with the chill of arrival, with a girl stepping off a ship and realizing the land she now belonged to did not look back. She was born in a palace of frost. In the Danish winter of 1456, beneath vaulted ceilings echoing with Latin prayers, Margaret opened her eyes for the first time. Her mother, Queen Dorothea, wept, not with joy, but with exhaustion. Her father, King Christian I, was told it was a daughter. He nodded once, then left the chamber. She was not the first. She was not the heir. She was not expected to rule. But she would be used. Because that was what daughters were, tokens. Bridges between kingdoms, wombs for future wars. And Margaret learned that early. Her cradle was carved with roses, but she was not coddled. Nurses taught her silence before speech, courtesy before curiosity. She walked slowly, bowed often, and learned to hide her opinions behind embroidered veils. They praised her for her calm. But calmness in a girl is often just obedience in a prettier dress. Her brothers played with swords. She was given embroidery hoops. Her cousins practiced archery. She was taught how to fold a letter so no ink would smudge. because a single smudge could end a marriage negotiation. Even her dolls had porcelain mouths that did not open. At 6, she was told she would marry. Not now, of course, but someday. A prince, a king, someone older. "You will be queen," they said. She nodded. She was used to things being decided for her. But at night, Margaret stared at the frost climbing the inside of her chamber windows, and she whispered into the cold, "Will they love me, wherever they send me?" The cold did not answer. At 12, she was shown a portrait. A man, face long, beard clipped, eyes narrowed, not cruel, just distant. James of Scotland, James III, a boy king, barely older than she was, already crowned, already wounded by rebellion. A marriage would unite Denmark and Scotland, a great political triumph. "Do you like him?" a lady-in-waiting asked, as if the question mattered. Margaret looked at the painted face. She said nothing. The ship left Copenhagen in the gray hours before dawn. Margaret wore a fur-lined cloak. Her hands were stiff from prayers. She was 15. As the waves crashed, the Danish coast faded. No one cried. No one waved. That was not royal. She stood at the edge of the deck. Salt stung her lips. The wind tore at her veil. She felt a drop of blood in her mouth, but bit it down. Behind her, chests of linen, holy books, and silver were packed tight. In front of her, Scotland waited, and it was colder than she imagined. The court at Edinburgh did not embrace her. It examined her. They commented on her dress, too plain, her voice, too soft, her hair, too light, her smile, too slow. She was foreign, and in courts, foreign often meant wrong. James met her at a feast. He did not touch her hand, he only nodded. They dined beside each other for hours without a word exchanged. She counted every bite he took. He never looked at her face. That night, she wept into a pillow that did not smell like home. But she learned. She adjusted her speech, softened her Danish accent. She learned which ladies whispered and which lied, which courtiers bowed out of respect, and which only to measure the value of her dowry. She dressed plainer, then simpler, then cleaner. And slowly, very slowly, the court began to tolerate her presence, but not her influence. James preferred other company. He spoke more with masons than ministers. He surrounded himself with musicians, goldsmiths, foreign scholars. Margaret watched, smiled, kept her thoughts folded in the corners of her handkerchiefs. At night, she listened to court songs drift through stone halls. None of them spoke of queens, and when she became pregnant, no one sang for her. The boy was born with little ceremony, James, the heir, a future king. And finally, for a moment, Margaret felt real, not borrowed, not placed, but part of the land. She had done what queens were made to do. She had given Scotland a son. For 3 nights, torches burned in celebration. But by the 4th night, they were out again. The halls were cold, and so was her husband's bed. She took up residence in Stirling, a castle not far, but far enough. James did not visit often. He is busy with affairs of state, they told her. But the letters she sent were never answered. And the last time she saw him, he said only, "The boy's hair is like yours." Then he left. In Stirling, Margaret tended gardens. The peasants liked her. She treated them with gentleness. She listened to their children, gave them coins and crusts of bread. But the nobility mocked her. called her the Queen of Flowers, said she cared more for bees than bloodlines, more for books than battles. And in time, the rumors came. She opposes the king's alliances. She speaks to Danish envoys behind closed doors. She is unwell. She grew thinner, not from illness, but from absence. Absence of joy, of food, of company. The servants were changed. Some of her ladies were sent back to Denmark. A physician was denied entry. She wrote again. To James, to her brother in Denmark, to the Pope. But no one answered. The days grew shorter, and the rooms darker. She stopped asking for candles. She stopped opening the curtains. She stopped brushing her hair. She slept in shifts. Dreams interrupted by the echo of doors she could no longer open. And her mirror? It began to turn against her. One morning she asked for bread. The maid hesitated, looked away, said, "There is none today." Margaret nodded, smiled weakly. That evening she whispered to the empty room, "Then tomorrow, I will not ask." No feast was called when she died. No messenger rode through the night. No proclamation from the king. Her body was prepared quietly, wrapped in linen, placed in a box not meant for a queen. No crown, no veil, only silence. And the silence screamed louder than bells. In Edinburgh, they said she died of fever, a passing illness. Such things happen, they shrugged. In Denmark, the court received a letter. The queen has passed. Her son is well. Nothing more. But in Stirling, in the walls that held her last breath, the stone never forgot, and the rose bush she had once planted, it withered, then bloomed again, every year. On the day she died, she was born into frost and died in shadow, not by blade, not by exile, but by silence, by forgetting, by absence. They called her queen, but never let her reign. But the echoes were not done, because sometimes a room remembers what people choose to forget. And Margaret's room was beginning to speak. After her death, they locked the room, not out of respect, not to preserve it, but because it had begun to echo. Servants said they heard breathing, shuffling, a whisper behind the stone, as if the walls themselves had learned the sound of a dying queen, and were trying to remember it aloud. No one visited Stirling unless they had to. Courtiers avoided the West Wing. Nobles feigned forgetfulness. Even the bishop blessed only half the castle, because something had shifted, not politically, not publicly, but spiritually. The kind of shift that makes flame flicker without wind, that makes mirrors frost over from within, that makes a maid drop a tray of bread for no reason, then cry without knowing why. The room had grown colder, even in summer. Birds avoided the sill. A rose bush outside the window shriveled, except for one bloom which refused to fall. It blackened, dried, and clung to its stem like a secret. Inside, her bed remained, sheets stripped, the pillow stained, a book left open to a page she never finished. It read, "God sees even what the silence hides." James never returned to the room, not once. He sent others to collect the linens, the letters, the ring she never wore. They took her comb, her hairbrush, her silver cross, but they left one thing behind. A small scrap of paper wedged beneath the mattress. It read, "I am not angry, I am just no longer hungry." No one ever claimed to write it. No one dared keep it. In Edinburgh, They erected a chapel, small, simple. No statue of her likeness, only a plaque, with her name misspelled, and the dates barely legible. James remarried within a year. The new queen wore red often. She hosted banquets. She laughed loudly. Margaret had never laughed loudly. But the people remembered her. Not the nobles, not the ministers, but the villagers. Those who once felt her fingers press a coin into their palm. Those who tasted her bread. Those who saw her weep once, quietly. When a child brought her a daisy, they left flowers outside the castle. Not roses, daisies, every year, on the same day. And each year the castle guards found one daisy tucked into the west wing's doorframe. Even when the castle was locked, especially when it was locked. Some said she haunted the tower, not in rage, not to scare, but simply to be there, to exist. Because even in death, Margaret feared being erased. One maid reported hearing singing, a lullaby, soft, Danish, off-key. But when she opened the door, nothing. Only the draft of winter in the middle of July. A knight once saw a figure in white standing by the window, hair unbound, arms crossed like wings, looking out. He called for her. She didn't turn. She only vanished, slowly, not with fear, but with dignity, like someone accustomed to being ignored. The room became a place of warnings. Children were told, if you disobey the crown, you'll sleep where the queen starved. But the punishment never worked, because the children said, the queen wouldn't hurt us. And they were right. Margaret never sought vengeance, only remembrance. In time, her son grew, James IV. He was told his mother had died of fever, but once, only once. He asked an old servant, did she suffer? The servant did not speak. He only handed the boy a handkerchief, lace-trimmed, faded, stitched with an initial. The boy kept it, folded, in his sleeve, for years. Until one day, before battle, he dropped it on the ground. It was soaked by rain, never dried, and was never found again. But some say that night, he cried in his tent, not for his kingdom, but for the woman no one told him to mourn. And still, the room in Stirling whispered. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes sobbing, once just breathing, so close a maid thought it came from her own chest. And once, they say, the smell of fresh bread, faint, warm, gone in a blink. The walls had memory, more than the court, more than the king, more than the history books that gave Margaret one line, then moved on. And if you stood very still in that room, if you listened with more than your ears, you could hear it, not in words, but in weight, in absence. In that thick, cold air that presses against your ribs and makes you feel like someone is missing. There was no justice, no reckoning, no queen's trial, no confession, just time and silence, and a room that would not forget. Decades later, when Stirling was being renovated, a mason found something. Behind a brick near the hearth, wrapped in cloth, pressed flat, a letter, unfinished, written in Margaret's hand. The ink was faded, but the final line could still be read. If I am remembered, let it not be for how I died, but for how long I waited to be seen. To this day, her portrait hangs in no great hall. Her tomb is unmarked, her crown melted into another queen's. But somewhere in Stirling, a room still stands, locked, stone cold, whispering, not loudly, just enough for those who choose to listen. Because when power silences a queen, it must rewrite the truth. But sometimes, the lies crack before the stone does, and the truth leaks out, in footsteps, in flowers, in rooms that breathe. Power does not always lie. Sometimes it just forgets, on purpose. When Margaret died, no trumpets sounded. But the court moved quickly, not to mourn, but to erase. The records were the first to go. Her letters, written in Danish and French, were declared incompatible with national record-keeping. They were burned. One clerk later whispered that the pages didn't catch fire easily, as if they knew they weren't meant to vanish. The physician who tried to reach her room in Stirling, dismissed without reason. The letter of dismissal bore no signature, just a wax seal already cracked. He packed his bags and left for Flanders. But before he left, he gave a scroll to a nun in Leith, wrapped in linen, unopened since. It read only, "The Queen did not die of fever. She died of neglect, and the heir knew it." The paintings came next. There had only been two of Margaret, one in Edinburgh, one in Holyrood. In the first, her eyes were lowered, hands folded, meek. In the second, she stood beside her son, a faint smile, a daisy pinned to her gown. Both disappeared within weeks of her death. One was damaged in a fire. The other was gifted to a distant cousin. Neither was seen again. But years later, in the cellar beneath Dunfermline, a canvas was found beneath a rotting tapestry. It was blackened, molded. But in one corner, barely visible, was a daisy, still pinned. Even her name was made smaller. In royal documents, she became the late Queen Consort. Never Queen Margaret, not even the King's beloved. Just late. And in one list of monarch's spouses, the scribe skipped her entirely, jumped from Mary of Guelders to Margaret Tudor, as if the cold years in between had never held a queen at all. The child, James IV, was told only that his mother had passed peacefully. And when he asked why no prayers were said in her memory, the priest replied, "Her soul was quiet enough. No bell needed to call it." But Scotland was not quiet, not entirely. A rumor began to circulate, not among lords, not in Parliament, but in kitchens, in cloisters, in corners of taverns where the candles burned low. They said she had been left alone, that no one came, that she had grown thin, too thin, that when she died her hand was still stretched toward the door, not knocking, just waiting. The Crown dismissed it. Gossip, peasant exaggeration, political nonsense. And perhaps it would have faded, if not for the daisies. Every spring, daisies bloomed in a perfect ring outside Stirling Castle's west wing. No one planted them, no gardener claimed them, but they returned, year after year, in silence, like a memory the earth refused to bury. One year, a visiting noble stepped on the ring by mistake. That night, he claimed to see a figure in white at the end of his bed. She didn't speak. She only looked. And in the morning, he left. Without saying why, the Crown tried again to control the narrative. They had the castle chapel scrubbed, new priests appointed, masses said in Latin with no mention of Margaret. They even renamed the corridor where she had once walked daily, from Queen's Passage to South Hall. But no one used the new name. Not even the servants, because even words remember, when they've been whispered often enough. Years passed. The king remarried. The new queen bore children. Margaret's son grew taller, colder, and more distant. When he looked in the mirror, some said, he saw his father's eyes. Others said, his mother's mouth. Silent, in Denmark, no mourning was held. Only a short announcement. Princess Margaret has passed. We pray for her soul. No embassy sent. No crown of flowers, no candle lit in her childhood church. And yet, in one abbey in Jutland, a nun lit a candle anyway, every year, on the same day. She claimed she once knew a girl who smiled with her eyes, but never with her mouth. A girl who folded letters so carefully it was as if she were stitching words into cloth. The nun never gave a name, but the candle never missed its date. What the court didn't understand was this. Forgetting is hard when the dead still breathe in rooms you sleep in. In 1501, Stirling Castle underwent repairs. A mason broke through a wall near the old west wing hearth, found a hollow. Inside, dust, ash, and a melted brooch, gold shaped like a daisy. No one claimed it. No one recorded it. But the mason's apprentice swore the stone inside the brooch was still warm. Even today, Margaret's story is not told in history books. She is a footnote, a date, a marital alliance. But in Stirling, if you step into the right room and breathe in long enough, you'll feel it. A weight, not heavy, just present. Like someone watching, not haunting, just remembering. The court forgot her name, but the walls never did. And walls, unlike kings, do not lie. Because the tragedy was not just in her death, but in the slow erosion of a life spent waiting for letters that never came, for doors that never opened, for a love that spoke too late. Waiting does not always look like a woman at a window. Sometimes it looks like bread growing hard on a plate, like ink drying in a letter that was never sent, like footsteps that start toward a door and then turn back. Margaret waited, not once, not loudly, but daily, quietly, until waiting became her only ritual. She waited for letters, from James, from Denmark, from anyone. The servants told her, "Nothing came today, Your Grace." She smiled and returned to her desk, picked up her quill, wrote again, even when her fingers trembled, even when the ink froze in its bottle, even when the page beneath her hand warped from the weight of unshed tears. She waited for news of her son. "Is he well?" she asked a guard once. He hesitated, then said, "Aye, Your Grace." She whispered, "Does he ask for me?" The guard looked at the floor, then turned and walked away. She waited for a knock. Every night she left her door unlatched just in case James came, or a messenger, or mercy, but no one came, not even by mistake. She waited for Sunday bells, but Stirling no longer rang them for her. The chapel doors were often closed, and when Mass was held, her name was not spoken. She still folded her hands, still knelt, still prayed. Not for salvation, but for acknowledgement, for someone somewhere to remember she was alive. Her chamber grew colder, not from winter, but from forgetting. Firewood was delivered late. Blankets were thinner. Her clothes no longer stitched anew. Once, she found a rip in her sleeve. Small, barely visible. She asked the maid to mend it. The maid nodded, but never returned. She stopped asking, because asking became a wound. Each question was a cut, each silence salt. So she swallowed them, let them bleed inside. And when she passed a mirror, she no longer looked, not out of vanity, but because her reflection had started to look like someone else, someone smaller, someone fading. One evening, a plate of food arrived. Porridge, cold, gray. She didn't touch it, not out of pride, but because she wanted to see if anyone would notice. They didn't. The next day, the same plate returned, untouched, yet never asked about. Her bed became too large. She began sleeping curled at its edge, a child again, wrapped in robes too grand for a body too thin. She pulled the sheets to her chin, imagining they were arms. Not royal, not powerful, just human. She stopped writing, not because she had nothing left to say, but because the letters never returned. Ink without answer becomes grief. Paper without reply becomes a grave. She once asked a maid to sing, a lullaby, anything. The girl looked startled. I don't know any, Your Grace." Margaret nodded. "Then hum." The girl hummed, soft, off-key, afraid. It was the most music Margaret had heard in months. One night, Margaret stood by the window. Snow outside, wind cutting against the stone. She placed her hand on the glass. It did not frost, because the cold was not outside anymore. In her final weeks, she spoke less, not from illness, but from economy. Words are precious when no one listens. She conserved them, like coins, spent only when necessary. "Sometimes," she whispered to herself, "not stories, not prayers, just names, her son's, her mother's, her own, as if repeating them would anchor her to the world." Then came the day she stopped speaking at all. A maid entered with a jug of water, set it down, curtsied, turned to leave, then paused. Margaret was sitting in her chair, still, eyes open, hands folded, but unmoving. The maid called her name, once, twice. No answer, only breath, shallow, slow, almost thoughtful. That night the maid told the steward, "The queen is not ill, but she is not well." The steward did not look up. "She's been that way for years." Margaret lived another week, not truly alive, but not yet gone. She drank when offered, ate little, spoke nothing, just looked at the door, as if someone might open it, as if someone had promised to. And then she slept. One night, she closed her eyes. The candle at her bedside burned low. Its flame flickered, not from wind, but from breath. Hers, weakening. She did not stir, did not speak, did not cry, because by then, she understood. She had waited too long. When the maid found her, Margaret's face was calm, her hands cold, her lips parted, as if her final word had never escaped. They said she died in her sleep, but sleep implies rest, and Margaret had never truly rested, only waited. And what is waiting, if not the slowest form of death? Because in the end, it wasn't her body they buried, it was her memory. And they did it quietly, without mourning, without music, without a name. When kings die, bells ring, torches blaze, banners drop to half-mast, streets fall silent, and mourning robes flood the court. But when Margaret died, there was nothing. No bell, no prayer, no procession. Just a breath that ended, and a door that stayed shut. She died at night. The candle beside her flickered once, then went out. The maid who found her didn't scream, didn't run. She simply stared, because the room had already known. The walls had grown still, the air had thickened, and silence had curled itself around the bed like a shroud. The steward was informed. He nodded. Wrap her, quietly, before sunrise. No announcement, no priest called, no royal physician summoned. Just two servants with cold hands, lifting a body that weighed less than memory. They did not dress her in royal linen. No ermine, no embroidery, no crown. They placed her in a simple gown, one she had worn many times, one no longer scented of lavender, only dust. The chamber was stripped, the pillow burned, the bed sheets washed and reassigned, her comb given to another lady in waiting, her letters, those not already gone, shoved into a box marked private estate. The daisy brooch was missing. No one asked about it. They placed her in a box. Not a coffin, not royal wood, just a box, unmarked. Pine. Nails hammered too quickly, as if sound itself was unwanted. It was carried through the hallways before sunrise, through servants' corridors, avoiding chapel, avoiding eyes. She was not taken to the royal crypt. She was not taken to the chapel at Holyrood. She was not laid among queens. Instead, she was buried in the garden behind the west wing, where daisies bloomed. No one knew who dug the grave or who chose the spot. But one servant years later said, "The ground was already soft," as if waiting. James III did not attend. He was hunting. When informed, he said nothing. No black ribbon on his sleeve, no speech, only silence. The kind that isn't empty, but full of intention. Days passed. No public notice was issued, no mourning declared. The court moved on. They celebrated a diplomatic guest. They toasted a new trade deal. They rehearsed a wedding for someone else. As if Margaret had never stood in those halls, never wept on those stones, never walked those gardens. But something remained. Not her, not in body, but the room. It changed. Maids refused to enter it alone. They said the candlelight flickered there even when no window was open, that the fire refused to catch, no matter how dry the wood. One girl swore she saw footsteps in the ash near the hearth, small, bare, as if the queen still paced in sleep. Another claimed she heard a whisper, soft, Danish, saying only, "I waited." The steward ordered the chamber sealed. Not permanently, just until the air settled. But the air never did. No plaque was raised, no stone carved, no name etched. The daisies, however, continued to bloom, even in frost, even in shadow. One year, a child placed a single white candle near the cluster. The flame did not flicker, even in wind. Years later, when James died, he was buried with ceremony. Mass, trumpets, crimson banners. They laid him among kings, placed a sword on his chest, a lion on his tomb. But none who stood at his grave mentioned Margaret, and none who buried her ever stood beside it again. In time, those who had known her died too, or were replaced, or forgot. and the silence grew heavier. Not because no one spoke, but because too many chose not to. And when her son, James IV, asked only once about the place where his mother lay, the bishop looked away and said, "Some queens rest quietly, best to let them lie. But walls never lie, and gardens never forget, and the earth, once it's tasted grief, always remembers where it buried the body." They say now that if you walk the West Garden at dawn, when the light is pale and no one is watching, you'll feel it. A weight, not on your shoulders, but in the soil beneath your feet, like breath, held just below the surface. No bell was rung, but bells are not the only things that mourn. Sometimes mourning is the crack in a stone, the rot in a tapestry, the locked room no one enters anymore. And if you stop long enough, you might hear it too. A sound not carried by wind, but by memory, by everything the court tried to silence and failed. Because Margaret never needed an army or a crown, only time. Time to let the truth echo louder than the lie, because forgetting is not a moment. It's a strategy. And the more deliberately they erased her, the more clearly she began to return. Forgetting a queen is not done by fire. It's done by dust. By the slow covering of memory. By the shifting of curtains. By the ink that fades, not because of time, but because someone stopped reading. After Margaret died, Scotland moved on. Not suddenly, but precisely, with quiet choices, one name omitted from a list, one title left off a proclamation, one seat left unassigned at a feast. No monument was torn down, no decree declared her unworthy. They did not need to destroy her legacy. They simply declined to build one. The first thing they removed was her face. The portrait at Holyrood vanished. No public notice, no scandal. Just a blank wall, a hook with no frame. When asked, the steward shrugged. Perhaps it was damaged, or gifted, or never there. And that became the official stance. Perhaps. Court musicians stopped playing the Danish hymns she favored. The embroidery circle she founded was dissolved. A book of prayers she had copied by hand was returned to the chapel, stripped of its dedication. And when new courtiers asked about the queen who lived in Stirling, the answer was always the same. "You mean the boy's mother?" As if motherhood was the only part of her worth remembering. Even her language disappeared. No more Danish spoken in the halls. Her letters, those that weren't burned, were tucked away in archives no one catalogued. She had once tried to teach the court her lullabies. Now, no one could hum even one. At the chapel, the priest was instructed to stop offering mass in her name. "The king has remarried," they said. "It is not proper to confuse the congregation." No candle was lit, no bell rung, no name whispered. It was as if she had never knelt there, never wept into the wood of the pew, never left a daisy pressed into the page of a hymn. But forgetting is not just action, it's architecture. At Stirling, her chamber was renamed. The Queen's Room became North Quarter Suite. The doorway repainted, the stone floor scrubbed, the windows resealed. A new lady-in-waiting was placed there, briefly. She lasted 3 nights. On the 4th, she claimed she heard breathing from the hearth. Not angry, not frightening, just continuous. As if someone was still trying to exist, records of her death were reduced to a line. Queen consort Margaret, deceased of fever, 1486. No mention of location, of days without food, of unspoken prayers. Just a year, a cause, and nothing more. Even the year was later questioned. Some scholars place her death in spring, others autumn, because no one recorded the season. No one cared what trees were blooming, or if the garden daisies had opened. They forgot her slowly, and yet deliberately. And the cost of that forgetting was not only Margaret, but the truth. In Denmark, her memory dimmed as well. The court had other children to marry, other alliances to maintain. Her brother, now king, sent no envoys, no painters, no funds for a tomb. A Danish diplomat wrote, "The princess was lovely, but quiet. A soft voice is easy to lose in wind." By the time her son reached adulthood, the only sign of Margaret was in his cheekbones and his silence. James IV was known for his piety, his diplomacy, his need to please. Some say he smiled too easily. Others say he never truly smiled. One day, he walked the garden at Stirling, alone. He stopped by a ring of daisies and stood, until a servant approached. "Your Majesty?" He blinked, then said only, "She liked these." No name, no explanation. He never returned. At court, new tapestries were hung. New names filled the ledgers. New queens sat on thrones Margaret never warmed. But at the edge of every record, there was still a silence. Not a blank space, but a bruise. Because forgetting is never perfect. A page goes missing. A date doesn't match. A servant remembers a scent, lavender or candle wax or something fainter. A crack appears in the corner of a room. And when the wind blows through, it sounds like a voice saying, "I was here." In time, rumors returned. Of a queen who died of hunger. Of a garden that bloomed unnaturally. Of a chamber no one could sleep in. The crown denied them. The court dismissed them. But the people? The ones in villages? The ones who passed down stories like bread? They did not forget. They couldn't. Because some grief lives in soil, in fire, in rooms that hold breath long after the lungs are gone. And in one manuscript, tucked inside a monk's collection, a single sentence was scrawled in the margins. The queen died not from illness, but from being unneeded. That line was never published. But someone read it, copied it, passed it on. And so her silence kept echoing, through cracks, through gaps, through every deliberate attempt to erase her. Because history may be written by power. But memory? Memory clings to the forgotten, wraps itself around them like roots, and waits, not for justice, but for breath, for one more whisper, because Margaret may have waited in silence. But the earth did not, and what grows from buried grief can sometimes bloom louder than a king's decree. At first, nothing changed. The garden stayed quiet. The chamber stayed sealed. The name stayed absent. And yet, beneath it all, something moved. Not loudly, not quickly, but deeply. Like roots beneath stone, like breath beneath frost, like grief that does not die, but settles. They tried to silence her with forgetfulness, but the earth does not forget what it has swallowed, especially not a queen, especially not one who starved within its walls. In Stirling, the daisies never stopped blooming, even in harsh winters, even when every other flower curled and died, even when the gardener dug them up. They returned, not spread, not scattered, but always in the same ring, as if marking something. Children began to call it the circle. They whispered dares. Touch the middle stone. Leave a coin on her birthday. Say her name if you remember it. Most didn't. But they knew what she was. The one who waited. The one who wasn't fed. The one who never screamed. One year, a boy placed a candle in the center. It burned for 3 days, through rain, through fog, even through a night of wind that blew out every torch in town. But that candle stood and flickered and wept wax like tears. In a convent near Edinburgh, an old nun kept a diary. It was never published, never meant for eyes but her own, and in it, a passage. They buried her without prayer, but every spring my bones ache, and I dream of a woman in white who never speaks, but watches me from under the trees. Centuries passed. Monarchs rose and fell. Wars came and went. The chamber remained locked, but the air changed. A historian visited Stirling in the 1700s, researching trade routes, politics. He stayed in the North Wing, and one evening, while walking the grounds, he saw the ring. He wrote, "A curious formation of daisies, unnaturally arranged. The soil beneath them is softer than it should be. No gardener claims responsibility. Local children refuse to step in the center." He moved on, but that entry survived, in a box, in a library, in a folder marked Miscellaneous Folklore. Later, a poet found it. She had never heard of Margaret, but she visited Stirling, walked the garden, felt something. That night, she wrote, "There is a hush in the castle's bones. A woman waits, not for rescue, but for recognition." It was published in a small collection. It did not sell well, but one copy made its way to Denmark. In the 1800s, a Danish archivist read the poem. He searched through old correspondence, found a single letter, unsigned, sent from Stirling in 1486. The wax seal was broken. The ink nearly vanished, but the closing line remained. "May God forgive us. She deserved more than hunger." The archivist tried to find her grave. No records, no stone, only rumors. But when he visited Stirling, he stopped at the garden and froze. He claimed the wind moved in circles, that the daisies turned toward him, that the ground hummed. He left a daisy on the soil and wept. Not long after, a local school teacher began gathering legends. She interviewed elders, recorded tales once dismissed as superstition. One woman, nearly blind, said, "My grandmother told me there was a queen here. Not loud, not cruel, just forgotten. But the flowers remember." Then came the paintings. Not portraits, not commissions, just sketches from artists who claimed they dreamed of a woman in white, hair undone, eyes calm, hands empty. No one paid attention. But slowly, Margaret re-entered the canvas of history. Not with triumph, but with tenderness. A musician composed a dirge. He said it came to him in sleep. He named it the Queen's Breath. It began with silence, then a single low note, then strings, soft, wavering, like footsteps across stone. It ended with a high, faint chord, as if someone had exhaled for the first time in centuries. The chamber was reopened briefly in the early 1900s. Historians cataloged it, photographed it, measured it. They found nothing of note. But one assistant refused to re-enter the room. She said, It's not haunted. It's watching. Then in 1934, a young scholar at the University of Edinburgh was studying royal lineages. He stumbled on a discrepancy. One queen consort, no tomb, no recorded cause of death, beyond fever. He dug deeper, found the poet, the archivist, the circle of Daisies, and wrote an article, Margaret of Denmark, the Vanished Queen. It was mocked, dismissed, but it was read, and the name returned. Today, Margaret's story is still not taught in every classroom, still not carved into monuments, still not etched into gold. But it is spoken, in quiet places, by those who understand that not all queens wear crowns. Some wear silence, some wear hunger, some wear the weight of a locked door. And the earth? It still speaks, in blooms, in wind, in rooms that never warm, in lullabies that no one remembers learning. Margaret did not return with fire. She returned with roots. And roots are patient. They wait. They rise. They crack stone not with fury, but with presence. Because what the crown erased, the people whispered. What the church buried, the soil grew back. And what history forgot, art remembered. For centuries, she was no one. No grave, no portrait, no hymn. Just a silence tucked inside royal scrolls. A space in the line of queens. A chamber left locked because it felt too loud for something so empty. But silence does not stay silent forever. It waits. And then it speaks. The first time her name returned to the public, it was sung. Not by a choir, not by a royal decree, but in an opera. In 1971, a Danish composer wrote a piece called Margrethe. He said it came to him in fragments, dreams, whispers, wind against glass. The story: a young queen who gave birth, then vanished. A crown she never wore, a bed she never left, a death no one acknowledged. Her final aria? No words. Just one long note, held so gently, so sorrowfully, that the audience forgot to breathe. Later that year, a historian was invited to speak on BBC Radio. He was meant to discuss dynastic marriages. Instead, he said, "There was a queen named Margaret. She died in Scotland. We forgot her. And that forgetting tells us more about ourselves than her story ever did." The program received letters, dozens, from listeners asking, why wasn't she in our textbooks? No one had an answer, but suddenly, the question existed. In 1994, a Scottish novelist published The Daisies of Stirling, a fictional retelling, romanticized, but haunting. The novel never became a bestseller, but readers remembered her. They underlined passages, folded corners. One passage became quoted again and again. They took her crown, they took her voice, but the earth wrote her name in flowers. Museums followed. The National Gallery displayed a sculpture titled Unfed. It was not labeled as Margaret, but it was her. A seated woman, thin, stoic, hands open, mouth closed. Visitors stood for minutes. Some cried, not because they knew her, but because they felt like they had. Then came the researchers. They revisited letters, found slips, clues, marginalia. One phrase repeated in different hands. The queen was unwell. The queen was quiet. The queen was alone. They began to piece together timelines, locations, cross-reference Danish and Scottish archives. A new picture emerged, not complete but unmistakably her. And her name, Margaret, reappeared. In lectures, in footnotes, in articles about the overlooked consorts of medieval Europe. One scholar wrote, "She was not just the mother of James IV. She was a woman, left to fade, and the fading itself was political." Tour guides at Stirling began mentioning her again. At first, briefly, softly, uncertainly. There was a queen who lived here, briefly, died young. We don't know much, but there's a garden she loved. Visitors asked questions, wanted to see the chamber, the garden, the daisies. A sign was placed outside the west wing. It read, "In memory of Margaret of Denmark, Queen Consort, 1456 to 1486. She waited. Now we remember." A new generation found her on the internet. Artists drew her in white. Poets imagined her final thoughts. YouTubers made videos with soft piano and subtitles that read, "She died hungry, but not forgotten." And her name became more than a footnote. It became a thread, pulled gently but persistently through the fabric of forgotten queens. Margaret did not become famous, not in the way kings do, not with parades or coins or monuments, but she became felt. And in history, that is harder and more permanent. In 2018, a group of schoolchildren were asked to write about a woman history forgot. One girl wrote, "Her name was Margaret. She lived in a castle. She died alone. I don't want to forget her. So I'm writing her name here. Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." That page now hangs in a museum in Edinburgh. Not in a gold frame, just pinned to a wall. Beside it, a single daisy. Fresh, replaced every week. No one knows who leaves it, but it is never missing. Because sometimes the most powerful resurrection is not in statues, but in whispers passed down. In footsteps that pause by a forgotten garden, in a name spoken softly, because someone, somewhere, needs it to be heard. Because her story was never just about death. It was about erasure. And how being erased does not mean being gone. Not if someone remembers. Not if you do. Some stories end with fire, with swords, with revolutions. Margaret's story ended with silence. But silence, when carried long enough, becomes weight. And weight leaves a mark, even on stone. She did not die with screams. She did not shake the throne. She did not leave behind manifestos, lovers, wars, or scandals. She left behind a room, a garden, a name whispered by children who never met her. And somehow, that was enough. Her silence did something no rebellion ever could. It lingered, through generations, through wind and wood and window, through denied archives and torn portraits, through the aching space where her voice should have been. And now, we feel it. Not like thunder, but like air shifting in a room you thought was empty. Because Margaret was never loud, never commanding, never what the world calls strong. But strength wears many faces. Sometimes it looks like waiting. Sometimes like dignity held in a trembling hand. Sometimes it looks like refusing to disappear, even when everyone insists you must. History didn't need her, not to explain battles, not to mark treaties. But we need her, now. Because Margaret reminds us what it means to be human in the margins. To suffer without spectacle. To be erased not for what you did, but for what you didn't. For not being useful, not being loud, not being powerful enough to demand attention. And yet, she remained. In roots, in flowers, in footsteps that didn't echo quite right. Her voice, unwritten, unsung, grew sharper the longer it was absent, until eventually, the silence became unbearable. What is the weight of a silence that lasts 500 years? It is the hush after a final breath. It is the empty space in a family tree. It is the cold of a locked room, untouched for centuries. It is the question we ask now: how many others have we lost this way? Margaret was not unique in her suffering. That is what makes her important. She is every woman told to wait. Every figure overlooked because they did not rule loudly. Every name crossed out gently, so no one would notice the erasure. And yet, we noticed. We are noticing. And in that noticing, she lives. Not as a ghost, not as a legend, but as a person. Someone who laughed softly, loved her son, sat at windows, wrote letters no one read. Someone who didn't get a funeral, but got a flower, didn't get a monument to, but got a melody, didn't get justice, but got memory. Her story is not a call to arms. It is a call to attention, to look at the quiet places, to listen to the unspoken histories, to ask, who are we forgetting? Because forgetting is easy. But remembering, that's work. And that work, that is how we build justice. Not with noise, but with names. So remember hers, not because she was queen, but because she was not allowed to be. Not because she suffered, but because she was meant to disappear and didn't. Not because her death was tragic, but because her silence now speaks for so many. Her name was Margaret. She was born in Denmark. She died in Stirling. She loved daisies. She waited too long. And now, finally, she is heard. We tell her story not because she won a war, but because she lost everything, quietly, and still mattered. Not to mourn, but to witness. Let it sit. Let it ache. Let it mean something. Because silence should not go unnoticed ever again. History usually celebrates the loud ones, the kings who conquered, the queens who ruled, the voices that shook empires. But Margaret reminds us of something deeper, that quiet suffering is still suffering. That being erased is not the same as being unimportant. She didn't lead armies. She didn't change laws. She didn't survive. But in her silence, in the way her name was taken, her voice was ignored, her death unspoken, she became a symbol of all the people history forgets. The ones who lived in locked rooms, who waited at cold windows, who were told they didn't matter, and believed it. Margaret matters because she shouldn't have had to wait that long to be seen as human. Telling Margaret's story hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was slow, soft, and that made it feel real. She wasn't a myth. She was a girl, then a wife, then a mother, then just missing. And for a long time, no one cared. That's the part that stays with me. It makes me wonder, who else have we let slip away in silence? Whose names have we erased just by not saying them? Maybe remembering Margaret isn't just about honoring her. Maybe it's about reminding ourselves that dignity isn't something you earn by being loud. It's something you deserve just by being alive.